The way I put this together, the way that Dr. Exelbert puts this together is in part what we learn in school, but also we're reading constantly through the literature. And this is not hidden, it's free. And, as I alluded to before, this seed library is available for anybody to learn. Hey, everybody, welcome. Tonight, we're going to talk about COVID and cannabis. And we have Dr. Exelbert here with us. And let's jump right in. So COVID and cannabis, it's more of a lecture than a fireside for tonight. And we're going to bite off plenty more than we can chew. I'm going to jump right into cannabinoids and COVID, sort of the meat of it for the people that don't have the attention to last much longer. We'll jump into cannabis and risks, the sort of risks of cannabis in COVID in this situation. Not so much risks in general, just in this case. And then more methodically cover cannabinoid benefits. How do cannabinoids work? Somewhat generally, but really with an eye toward what we're talking about here. What is COVID-19? There's a lot of craziness in the world these days, and we have a lot of facts that help us understand what COVID is. There's no reason to think about conspiracies when we have stuff that we can touch right in front of us. And how do cannabinoids work against COVID at a much more detailed level. Dosages and what the research is kind of pointing to is reasonable dosages. Spoiler alert, it's mostly translation from animal models, and they give these little animals plenty more than most people consume. And then last but not least, there's a ton of literature that kind of doesn't dive into the weeds on biology and physiology, but is more social and psychological and cultural. And I'll talk a little bit there about that stuff. In terms of questions, if people have questions, throw them into the chat. We'll try to get to them. This is going to be a pretty thick lecture, so maybe not so much time. And then for people that are interested, both Dr. Exelbert and I are available for consultations. This kind of talk is given free, and we're trying to teach the world. For those who want to learn more, the library that we host, the seed library, is the largest probably in the world, and it's free for everybody to search and read. And we have a dedicated folder just for this material, which, as you can see, is bit.ly/seed COVID. Spelling matters. All right, let's jump in. First, cannabinoids and COVID-19. So this is a whispering that this is the real stuff. It does work. We're going to dive deep in this lecture about how cannabinoids work at a cellular level. What you can see here is a graph showing CBD, cannabidiol, working on the one hand, cellular sort of communication in the immune system, cells that gobble up other cells, cells that communicate to other cells, and then chemistry that kind of floats through the body to cause an alarm so that your body can mount the resources it needs to beat this virus that doesn't belong. One of the ways that it does it directly is the middle graph here. You can see the ACE2 receptor. Most people these days have heard about that, and we're going to talk a little bit specifically about how ACE2 is involved. And then on the right, PPAR gamma is a receptor at a nuclear level, right at the DNA sort of inside the cell level. And that has a lot of implications for how CBD works toward many of these things. Stopping the virus from replicating, we'll talk about, as well as some things about our normal cell functions that are important in fighting this situation. To zoom in, this is a dizzying perspective, but under a microscope, you can see some pretty interesting stuff. So on the left side, you see basically a SARS-CoV-2 cell. And you can see there are lots of things that are highlighted, most of which will be gobbledygook for our lecture here, with one exception, which is the main protease, the SARS-CoV-2 mpro, which is a receptor that happens to engage with cannabis-based drugs. Spike protein is probably familiar to most people watching. And inside the cell, you can see stuff like RNA. Those are probably words that people are familiar with. In the middle here, you can see this viral molecule connecting with a host cell. And you can see in the middle, ACE2 receptors is one of the mechanisms that happens. You can see as the virus goes into the cell, it's being involuted, it's being wrapped in sort of the cell's membrane and pulled in. And as the cell inside our own host cell opens up, the RNA which is inside gets fused and uncoated. It gets translated. The material that's in there is basically translated into protein matter. And then, as you can see, sort of moving up and up to the right, the cell gets reformed, or inside the cell, viral particle cells get reformed and then exuded. Stuffed into this host cell is a little diagram where cannabidiol impacts. It's a little bit dizzy, and we're going to talk at more length, so I'll leave it out for now. But basically, this is essentially what's happening on a microscopic scale. We'll dive into more of this a lot later. So ways that CBD fights against COVID are many, but basically the highlights are it downregulates two key receptors for SARS-CoV-2, meaning the cell receptors that we were talking about, ACE2, is a receptor where the viral particle is touching the cell, comes in, and then sort of does its business. CBD happens to downregulate some of those receptors. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth, but basically these are known in models of human epithelia. So in a petri dish, basically scientists are cooking up cells which are identical to what's inside a human, and discovering what's happening under a microscope outside of a living body. Number two here, CBD is known for having wide-ranging immunomodulation. It's modulating, it's changing the way our immune system works, mitigating cytokine production. So cytokines are those alarms that kind of round out through the body, and CBD helps mitigate that, especially where acute lung injury comes into play. One of the things that we see when people have severe COVID infections is lots of lung injuries. And maybe Dr. Exelbert, you can talk a little bit about sort of what you see clinically when someone comes into the ICU and has a sort of bad case of COVID.
Sure. So if you all think about sort of how people are coming to the hospital or why, one of the first things they're getting is shortness of breath. And some of that is just because they're fatigued and they're tired. But that slide before that Dr. Kaplan was saying, that whole sort of change that's happening within the cells are happening into every single cell that basically lines the air sacs of our lungs, which are called the alveoli. And when you see a cytokine storm, or you see a description of all this inflammation, it's basically leaking fluid. That's probably the easiest way to think about it. And that fluid sits inside these tiny air sacs. And it's these air sacs where you're supposed to have exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So if those air sacs are wet, sort of like, if a battery gets wet, it's not going to transfer the information. It's not going to get things across. And so you're not going to get as much oxygen as you need, and you're going to get short of breath. When we look at x-rays, you'll see a lot more white than you should. And again, if there's fluid or if there's pus, which is, infections like a pneumonia, then you're going to start to see whiteness throughout the lungs. And I'm sure everyone has seen x-rays on TV over the last couple of years. But that's basically, in a very Cliff Notes version of these slides of what's going on in your lungs. And CBD is one of these things that does help, which Dr. Kaplan will get into, slow down this process. At least we've been able to see that in cellular level.
Yeah, no, and the last two on here, the PPAR gamma, I sort of alluded to before. One is a direct antiviral actor at a nuclear level. It's stopping viruses from doing their business. And then actually more along the line of the cell movement, it regulates what are called fibroblasts and myofibroblasts. This is basically some of the cell's recuperative technology. It's a little bit like scarring, if you think about that on a cut on the skin. And one thing that happens as someone has an infection over a long period of time is you get fibrosis, you get a little bit of scarring, and PPAR gamma can help regulate that. So long-term, I guess this is what I was just referring to. PPAR gamma helps with late-stage support. And this is really shown in an animal model of asthma. So it hasn't been shown in COVID. We're indirectly applying logic, which is if it shows up in an animal model of asthma and the animal is breathing with similar lungs as humans, we think, well, maybe this would work in humans too. We don't have direct evidence, but this is indirect. So now jumping back from the deep dive COVID and CBD, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about cannabinoids and then COVID and then more. Basically, there's an interesting study which shows in folks who have greater difficulty with activities of daily living, have higher psychological risks, the use of cannabis was associated with greater mental distress. So associated is not cause. And this is an interesting thing that we see in the literature, that sometimes cannabis shows up with badness. Someone's doing badly, and you know what? Cannabis is right there. And this is an association that we find in the scientific literature, but it is not necessarily a causation. This is a common element of understanding scientific literature that trips a lot of people up. They see cannabis, they see bad stuff, they think, oh, maybe they're suggesting cannabis is causing that. But if you think about folks who have severe disabilities, who have severe psychology maladies, chances are they don't like that, and they're trying to help themselves feel better, most of the time because the medical industry, medical infrastructure has failed them. Another interesting study in the folder for those who want to read it is that there's increased COVID-19 breakthrough infections in folks who were fully vaccinated, but happen to have substance use disorders. As you can see from the highlighted parts, folks who had substance use disorders, which is actually very complicated and worth its own lecture, but basically folks who are using so much that it's disabling, it's causing them severe dysfunction. So not your everyday consumer. These are sort of the extreme use case scenarios, but they were at increased risk for worse infections and breakthrough infections. And again, this is just neither here nor there. It's a statistic, it's a fact. Folks who are consuming tobacco happen to be at a less increased risk, which was interesting, 6.8% versus 7.8% for cannabis. But it's there, and I'm not afraid to admit sort of, what literature is not showing good things for cannabis. This is a sad truth. I think the fact is here that we're discovering that actually this study was looking at the differences between folks who were getting vaccines and using cannabis and those who weren't, and sort of what their attitudes were. It actually found that there was no difference between the two groups in terms of their willingness to get a vaccine. But they did refer to other literature that this group of researchers was sifting through that showed folks who are using cannabis over a full lifetime at heavy doses tended to be more reluctant to engage in health promoting behaviors. Dr. Exelbert and I see this clinically. Folks who are in the cannabis is natural medicine camp, tend to be extreme, I guess, in that belief. Some of them have been burned by the medical industry, and really some of them take to natural medicine as sort of, this is what Mother Nature intended. There's a sort of anti-human, anti-pharma take to natural medicine folks. But in large part, these are people who believe kind of in the natural history of human life and sort of have maybe more than appropriate skepticism or scruples in terms of what cannabis and pharmaceuticals are doing. Cannabinoids. What is in cannabis? Cannabis is not just one thing. Most of the modern media paints cannabis as THC and CBD. Those are two of over 400, over 150 cannabinoids. They happen to be the most populous, but they're not the most powerful necessarily. They're not the most prevalent necessarily. They're also, two of many in a petri dish that are dwarfed by all the others we can make. In total, there's something like 500, 560 metabolites. 150, as I mentioned, are cannabinoids, and there are 400 which are non-cannabinoid compounds, such as what are called terpenes, flavonoids, and a whole bunch of other stuff that might be more normal sounding to people. Steroids are actually found in steroid molecules are found in cannabinoids, in cannabis, as well as amino acids and sugars and proteins and fiber. Leave it there. The endocannabinoid system is not just cannabis. When we think about cannabis, we're talking about phytocannabis, so plant cannabinoids. Our bodies are born with an endogenous cannabinoid system. Our immune cells communicate in part through this endocannabinoid endogenous system. And that's made up of receptors, some of which we'll talk about here. Some receptors basically are things that sit on the top of a cell waiting for a communication signal to come. Some of them sit between a cell line and sort of volley communication from the outside to the inside. And others work differently. So we have endogenous cannabinoids, these molecules which are basically footballs that go from one cell to another. We have the receptors that catch the football. And then we have enzymes which either regulate how these endogenous cannabinoids are made or how they are transported, how they move from one cell to another or within a cell. And we also have enzymes that help break them down if a cell is dying or needs to be destroyed. This whole sort of group of stuff is considered the endocannabinoid system. The graph, yeah, I mean, basically shows, through all of these endogenous cannabinoids, they have effects on cancer, they have effects on bacterial infections, they have effects on other kinds of illnesses through either their nerve interaction, their immune system interaction, the way they interact with blood vessels, and then the way that they interact with the immune system, sort of armies.
I think one of the great take-home things about this slide is, if you look at the upper left where it mentions plant cannabinoids, it is through the plant cannabinoids or cannabis that, we learned about this endocannabinoid system. And so what's important, I think, for the folks listening is the endocannabinoid system has been around for years and years. It's just now we're able to talk about it. And this process or this dynamic interaction with this system with the whole body is always occurring, and it's occurring continuously. When this doesn't work well, we can have anything related to cancer, infections, or other diseases or symptoms. So I think what's important is that, we're talking about all of this because it's new information in terms of modern medicine. But what the interaction with cannabis in this system is what's fascinating to us and dynamic. And the fact that we have our own internal cannabinoids that we make on our own is where all this comes together. So, if you looked at this slide 20 years ago, it wouldn't have all these names on here, but it would have been called something different. But, now we know what's causing it and how great cannabis is related to this.
Right on. Known benefits, already we know that cannabis has benefit in motor activity, meaning it has an effect on how the muscles function, how they work, how they communicate with one another. We know that it has activity on microglial activity. These are cells in your brain that basically govern circadian rhythms. And there are many of them, and they do sort of cleanup work for the cell too, for the brain too. Some interesting research sort of showing things like Alzheimer's, this collection of plaques in the brain which don't belong can be ameliorated, can be fixed, can be helped in part by activity of these microglial cells. In folks who have Alzheimer's disease, microglial cells tend to be sort of slow and quieted, not working properly. And when they're activated, coincidentally through either a certain frequency of sound and light, at least in an animal model, or presumably with cannabinoids, which also have interesting microglial effects, some of the amounts of plaque in the brains get better. Myelin morphology. So around a nerve, you have essentially a coating of fatty stuff called a myelin sheath. And the way that myelin, that fatty stuff is arranged and sort of organized can be impacted by cannabinoids. And this is an interesting one. I hope I have a slide for it here, but basically recruiting hematopoietic cells, stem cells. This is an interesting thing that we often see in clinic. It seems like cannabis kind of works for everything. We don't really kind of get that. We don't know why yet. But in cases where it's working on the skin, we do see new skin cells kind of coming up, replacing ill skin cells, either from things like acne or psoriasis or scarring, even some sort of overgrowth tissue. We see a sort of refreshing of that tissue to healthier tissue. And it might actually be that it's stimulating some kind of stem cell action. And then anti-inflammatory paths, we're going to talk ad nauseum in this talk. One of the things that is important to mention is that, we all live on a balance of inflammation, meaning how active your armies are fighting for you. For some people, it's too little and they get sick a lot. For some people, they work too much and they're sick because their body is actually fighting against their own cells. So there's a natural balance in inflammation or immunity. And CBD and THC are well known to be very strong anti-inflammatory agents. They impact that balance in meaningful ways. One of the nice things about them is that they don't sort of stop it full force. They modulate it. But this is a subject that we're learning much more about, and you'll see the importance right here. This is a meaty slide worth some attention. When we think about how cannabinoids have impacted viruses, we don't have great evidence yet about COVID. We just haven't had COVID around that long, and it's still difficult for folks to jump on studying cannabis in COVID. But we do have evidence for cannabinoids as they impact other viruses. HCV, hepatitis C virus, is impacted. The replication of these HCV particles was down 86% when CBD was used in these experiments, which is basically the equivalent of a dosage of interferon alpha. And for the doctors who might be watching, that's a powerful impact. Another virus is Kaposi sarcoma herpes virus, KSHV. In that study, the CBD reduced the infected cell proliferation. These cells were not multiplying as much. It enhanced their apoptosis, so the sort of self-destruct mechanism of cells that were infected was enhanced. And interestingly, sometimes in virally infected cells, they replicate more than they should. They turn into sort of cancerous cells. This is commonly known, I guess, these days with HPV, human papillomavirus, and the derivation of warts as mini cancers. But in the KSHV study, it showed that they were preventing cancer formation in some of those cells. So if you think about how people view cannabis as potentially fighting cancers, this is at least one mechanism where that happens. Sort of virus causing cancer pathway. The third one here, TMEV, I think it's Tyler's murine encephalitis virus. In my mind, it's just an esoteric animal virus that they found, but the CBD reduced the white blood cell, the
leukocyte.
Leukocyte, that's it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Anyway, we reduced the white blood cell infiltration and microglial activation. So it worked and improved symptoms as well, but basically had veritable immunity action. And then in an influenza study, CBD also helped HIV. It has helped in this virus called the Borna disease virus, or vaccinia virus, and an orthopox virus. CBD has had impact. So this is not a strange thing. It's happened many times with lots of different viruses. There's clearly cellular mechanisms where inflammation is involved. This isn't sort of news to any clinician watching or anybody familiar with this topic. But somehow the discussion about cannabis impacting viral infections and the way people use cannabis might help for viral infections is sort of scandalous and interesting, but I wanted to kind of put that to rest here. We did. Oh, here we go. So cannabis works broadly. The way cannabis can impact cells is listed here. The takeaway point is basically it works in a lot of different areas, in a lot of different systems that are body-wide. This is not one specific small area of the body. It's everywhere, almost every cell in our body. How do cannabinoids work? So this is basically highlighting information about CB1 receptors, CB2 receptors for the last 40 years. People have known about those two, but actually there's a whole other group of receptors where cannabinoids are deeply involved. That's kind of what we're getting to here. In acute picture form, you can see in this slide, there are lots of different immune cells in the body, from macrophages, T cells, B cells. Some people have heard about natural killer cells. All of these cells have cannabinoid receptors on them. And let that sink in for a minute. Your entire immune system, the immune system of most animals in the animal kingdom, have a cannabinoid receptor built into it. This is a part of the fundamental communication of our bodies and the way that our immune system works. And it so happens that people, as we evolved, decided to take cannabis, and it felt a certain way. And we all know about cannabis as the sort of euphoric stuff. But a lot of people don't understand that this is a basic foundation of the way our alarm system works and our immunity works in the human body.
I think also going back to your last three slides, I think it's important for people to know that there really are not a lot of medications that treat viruses. I mean, when you think about one of the reasons why HIV was so devastating is that we had no real medicines to attack a virus that we were learning how it replicated. But really, there's only, and even as an ICU doctor, there's only about 2 or 3 viruses that we actually even have medication for, and it's really to slow things down. So the fact that you're spending a few slides on just showing all the possibilities with cannabinoids and viral mediated injury or viral induced cancers, and the fact that we're learning that now is really important.
Thank you. Yeah, no, sometimes I get lost in the weeds, as it were. I mentioned before that cannabis as a plant and as a medicine is not just CBD or THC. There are also these things alongside it called terpenes. And interestingly, terpenes, in this case, there's one called glycyrrhizin, added some extra effects for cannabinoids to be effective. This is abundant in lots of different plants, including cannabis. And as scientists are kind of sifting through what's in cannabis and looking to see what it's doing, they are sampling not just the major cannabinoids which sell on the street, but they're also looking at these other things that nobody probably has heard of and investigating those to see, wait a minute, is there any impact in those? We understand that CBD and THC seem to be doing good stuff, but what about the other stuff? And lo and behold, among those 550 different components of cannabis, almost all of them have some kind of action. And that just kind of goes to highlight plant medicine and how impactful it is. And as we explore what else is out there in the world, there's a lot out there which nature has built that we could mine a little bit better than we do. But interestingly, some studies showed that the combination of terpenes and CBD works twice as well as corticosteroids in treating COVID-19. This is not a published paper yet, but basically what they're showing is that CBD and terpenes, this natural plant, is actually helping people against what is a really horrible situation, but a very viable treatment. In another study, as you can read here, CBD was proven stronger antiviral than the reference drugs that we use today. Remdesivir is a mainstay of therapy now, right, Dr. Exbury?
Yeah, if you're hospitalized with acute COVID, yeah, remdesivir and Decadron would be the other, which is a type of steroid, dexamethasone. Yes, so that's pretty much the standard of care now.
And imagine here, this is just to sort of walk it back a step. This is just a very preliminary exploratory study, but in this small study, it showed that CBD had stronger effects. So imagine, if we had broader availability of research and interest and money kind of funding exploration, this might be a really interesting avenue to learn more. And it's also, on the other hand, quite shameful that we haven't. What is COVID-19? This is going to be a deep dive. So if you're ready to fall asleep, this is the way to do it. But I do want to talk about it so that everybody can hear kind of what's going on. We often talk about the illness outside and kind of what it looks like in the air, but we don't think about kind of how it's acting and what it's good for at a cellular level. So what is COVID-19? COVID-19, when we look as scientists in the hospital, in sort of the blood, this is what we're seeing. An inflammatory response that's manifested by pro-inflammatory cytokines. So these alarm system molecules through the body, including IL-1, IL-6, and IL-10. These will come up later in a lot of slides. And you don't have to know what they are, just recognize them and you'll see that they're all over, and both the cannabis side and the human natural side. So also in COVID is the overexpression of CRP. This is an inflammatory marker in the body. Higher neutrophil count. This is just a cell in the body that fights things that don't belong. Higher TNF, blood urea, and D-dimer. These are just blood tests basically that we as doctors can look at and sort of see when we have a collection of these that most likely it's because of a COVID-19 infection. Also coronavirus, the spike proteins of the virus binds to ACE2, this angiotensin converting enzyme 2 that we were talking about before. Those receptors are on the cell. The life cycle of SARS-CoV-2. This is the boring stuff, but I think worth highlighting and really interesting for hopefully some of the scientists who are reading or watching. The lifestyle, I'm going to read it out. just because I think it's important, is initiated by the binding between S protein of the SARS-CoV-2 and ACE2. So the viral particle is binding to this ACE2, a protein with an enzymatically active site on the surface of cells in the host lung cells or in other organ tissues. This spike glycoprotein on the virus, the S protein, mediates viral envelope fusion with host cell, meaning the virus is being swallowed up by the cell via endosomal pathways. This is just a normal pathway when cell communicates with another. It swallows up the receptor and what's bound to it and brings it in. As a result of the occurring fusion, the viral cell releases the RNA of SARS-CoV-2 into the host cell and converts the viral genome RNA into polyproteins 1AB and PP1A. So basically, as the virus and the pieces of the cell unwraps inside the cell, you have RNA there, which automatically goes to the normal cell machinery to produce proteins. And those proteins happen to be pieces of the virus, pieces of the part around the virus, pieces of the virus that's going to be shot into the bloodstream. The proteins are cleaved into small products by proteinases. So the printout of what this virus map is directing are printed out into proteins, separated into smaller pieces the way that the cell normally does. Papain-like protease and SARS-CoV-2 mpro are essential for the processing of proteins. So the mpro we talked about before, that's the receptor where the virus binds to the cell. That's an essential protein. Later, a sequence of subgenomic mRNA is formed by the polymerase. So this is basically just going into why what's happening at a cellular level. Viral proteins and genome RNA are accumulated into virons in the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi. These are parts of the cell, meaning viral genome and viral proteins are accumulated. They self-assemble into virons, into mini virus particles. And then they're transported into vesicles. This is normal communication in a cell to the extracellular compartment. So when our cells normally functioning, forget the virus, this is a process where communication hits a cell. The cell brings that communication bubble into the cell. It does its business, and then natural course of action. Some of this stuff goes to the outside of the surface and exudes outside of the cell. This is just the way all cells function. And it's the viral particle that's hacked to that process, allowing the cell, the normal machinery of the cell, to be replicating the virus instead of its own stuff. At this stage, so during this process, M1 pro-inflammatory macrophages and T helper cells secrete interleukins. So while this is all going on, there are cells which are swallowing up stuff that doesn't belong, and cells which sort of communicate that, hey, wait a minute, I see a particle on a cell that doesn't belong. Those are T helper cells. They happen to sometimes kill cells. They happen to sometimes serve as communication, but they secrete alarm particles. Sort of, oh my God, something's not right. Everybody, something is wrong. And it's not specific. It just says everybody kind of mount up. It's sort of like an alarm at an army base. You hear this siren. Nobody really knows what it's for, but there's panic, and that panic kind of begets other cells. And cells that are part of the army naturally come and either do their action, either swallow up what doesn't belong, or send other cells to kind of mount greater responses. And this is the part where Dr. Exelbert was referring before, the sort of stuff, the pus and the fluid in the lungs. That's what sort of manifests as part of the signal. And the third paragraph here, you can see at this stage, the sort of alarm system activation. The CB2 receptor activated by CBD administration inhibits inflammatory processes. So we were talking before about the CB2 receptor. That was the cannabinoid receptor on all of the natural cells. That's the receptor which is activated by CBD and actually kind of puts a mute button or sort of dials down the volume on some of these inflammatory processes. I'll leave it for here. It's a pretty thick slide. But Dr. Exelbert, anything you wanted to add there?
That is a great slide. Again, you said it, but I just want to reiterate. Our body does this for a lot of different things. I mean, all of our cells are sort of like, if you imagine living in your home, you're doing everything you can to protect someone from coming in, and then you're trying to get anything that's not needed, like your garbage or disposal, whatever that may be, and get it out. And so your cells are doing the same thing. There are different types of viruses. Some are called RNA and DNA, and we don't need to get into that. But again, this description of COVID is very similar to other viruses. It's just that the spike protein is what makes this unique, which is what causes this replication and process. But if you think along the lines of people different types of diseases or immune reactions, anywhere along this pathway, there can be a problem. And so that's why people respond differently to COVID. And, but hopefully with what we're learning about cannabinoids and of course, where all these things are working, that we can give, help fight the war, so to speak, better.
So 2 questions came from the audience. The first is, how do we translate data on in vitro antiviral activity of CBD versus remdesivir? So basically, in a petri dish, in one petri dish you have remdesivir. This is a steroid anti-inflammatory, and then in the other one you have CBD. How do you sort of translate that data? And this isn't a really interesting point. It's not a direct translation. What happens in a petri dish doesn't always happen in the human body. But it gives us a very clear vision. We're not seeing little minions jump out. We're not seeing, crazy fireworks happen. We're seeing very predictable things happening at a very isolated level. We can make inferences into a body, but it's not a guaranteed translation. That's part of the reason that there's a lot of hesitation. We don't guarantee that what happens in a petri dish happens in a body, and that's why we as clinicians are very careful applying the stuff that we're learning to human trials. Second question here, in broader strokes, are there any randomized controlled trials being conducted on CBD in COVID patients? So if you are still awake by the last slide, you'll see there's a ton, over 600 that I'm going to highlight that are being studied. All right, next slide. Kind of another view, a little bit more put together about COVID on the inside. Basically, what you're seeing here is lots of activity, lots of takeover of the body's alarm system and immune response. Not all of this is amenable to CBD, meaning when CBD or THC, when cannabinoids are there, they affect some of these, and some of these very directly, but also some of them indirectly, not specifically.
Patients need to keep in mind, all these things that Dr. Kaplan is saying, this is people who are doing very high level studying of things in a lab and also in hospitals that, that is not day-to-day patient care. So Dr. Kaplan brought up what's called the C-reactive protein a few slides about, which shows that there's inflammation. With a patient at the bedside, you can't measure all of these things. So we would use something like a CRP or the white blood cell count, which hopefully would be a representation of all these really detailed things that Dr. Kaplan is talking about. So I just want people to know that obviously we're learning all these things, but what happens at the bedside is also a little bit different. And hopefully, one day we'll be able to measure these things a lot quicker.
Oh, it's a brilliant point. Yeah, no, I should have made that. These are the things that we're learning in textbooks and sort of at research at a very high level of detail. As you said eloquently, not all of these are available to us as clinicians at the bedside. We can't test half of these things, but we know or we infer that they're happening in the background. So how do cannabinoids work against COVID? Basically, the way to understand it, I think simplest way is either through innate immunity or adaptive immunity. Innate immunity are the things that you're born with. Adaptive immunity are the things that you sort of learn. I guess the alarm system, the army of your body learns over time. Either pieces of viruses that you take as a vaccine, and then your body can recognize that and fight against that. You're not born being able to do that. To get a vaccine, the adaptive immunity understands what doesn't belong. That's the whole premise behind vaccines and their function. But you do have some cells in your innate immunity which literally crawl around and say, wait a minute, this doesn't belong. I'm going to chew that up and destroy it. So you have both types that are relevant. As you can see on the slide, CBD cannabinoids affect viral entry. We talked a little bit about that with the ACE2, and there's more to come there. And cannabinoids also help with reducing the overall alarm system with all of the chemical markers you can see on the slide, and then kind of the overaction of those alarms, because as I was hopefully verbalizing before, when you have an alarm system and sort of also alarming other alarm system generators, eventually you can get a whole cascade of these cells which are essentially screaming. You get such a loud voice of alarm that can cause problems. That's basically a cytokine storm, in a manner of speaking. Rehashing kind of how cannabis and cannabinoid products manipulate the host, modulate the host, just to rehash, it inhibits immune cell proliferation. So as cells are constantly regenerating to fight an illness. The CBD and THC derivatives calm things down. We don't have to freak out. The alarm system recognizes there's something there, but we can take it in stride. As we look at people who have died from COVID, one of the things that we see, most plainly is the body attacking itself, or evidence of the body attacking itself. And one of the horrors of COVID, and especially as it approaches death, is the body's just chewing itself up. And if we have something which can take a step back, take it easy, calm things down a little bit, that can go a long way. Also, cannabinoids reduce migration and antibody production. So antibodies help kind of fight other cells, signal them basically to be swallowed up and destroyed. Cannabinoids can help sort of slow that process down. They can induce apoptosis. So from a genetic perspective, the signal that causes a cell to self-destruct when it knows something is wrong sometimes gets gummed up or fogged by the thing which doesn't belong. And cannabinoids help unmask that, ungum it. And then they downregulate immunoregulatory genes. So at a genetic level, this is also effective. This we've covered. I just want to sort of reiterate this slide simply because it comes up so often in the literature. And as anybody goes through the folder with the papers that this talk is coming from, you'll see the same anti-inflammatory molecules are found in literally hundreds of studies. Interferon gamma is a major communication system of the body. Tumor necrosis factor alpha, a major communication system of the body. And this is impacted by cannabinoids as well as sort of other natural phenomena. So hopefully the picture you get, if you can ignore most of the details, is there is a swimming sea of intercommunicating molecules in the body. And one of the interesting takeaways here is cannabinoids can serve as one of those sea of molecules. And it just so happens that cannabinoids tend to be a chill out molecule. Of course, as people are taking cannabis, they feel more chilled out at a macro level, but on a micro level, that's also happening. And especially when things are kind of bubbling up and storming in dangerous ways, it seems like cannabinoids are really helpful to calm that down.
There's probably been no better example of what you're describing right now than in people that have, what's called rheumatoid arthritis, or those sorts of rheumatological conditions that cause arthritis. And if we think about over the last 10 years, on your second bullet, interferon gamma, tumor necrosis factor alpha, there are now drugs specifically uses to inhibit the of those specific cytokines. And and so the types of patients that we see, a lot of arthritic patients with joint pain, they have had huge help from cannabis, and this is really a cause of why that's happening.
Right on. PPAR gamma, it's pretty impressive, and it's brought up in literature, paper after paper, which is why I put it here. Basically, I think we've talked about the skinny enough here that I can gloss through this, but we can move on to ACE2 distribution. So ACE2 are these molecules, those receptors where the virus is getting in. They are found mostly everywhere. As you can see on this slide, there are very few organs where ACE2 isn't relevant, which is terrifying for the fact that this virus can get through everywhere, but also helps understand that for a viral particle, which is very virulent, it's very likely to infect other people. There's lots of places where this can cause damage. In the news, we've seen younger men with heart-related issues. You can see here, part of that might be because there are ACE2 receptors in abundance there. In most of these, you can see sort of areas where people have been affected. Central nervous system, there are people out there who are suffering from migraine headaches and headaches basically every day because of their COVID infection. What is ACE2 and tmprss? There we go, transmembrane serine protease. That's the one I could remember. These are essentially the catcher's glove, catcher's mitt on the top of the cell, and the part of the glove which is crossing the cell membrane, getting a signal in. These are amenable to cannabinoid impact, and let's leave it as simple as that. For people that want the evidence of that, you can read more. This is a sample of about 9 papers where this has been studied. And you can see sort of what effect it has across the board. It's anti-inflammatory, inhibitory. It's sort of helpful in a big picture. But this is not a one-shot deal. This is many studies over the last 4 years. Cytokine storm we've talked about. Hopefully, people get the idea. Cytokine storm is related to this release and alarm system begetting alarm system. And one of the interesting things is, we think about the sort of issues associated with COVID as, oh my gosh, you're infected with a lot of viral particles. But as I was hopefully trying to express with the pathology we see at time of death, viral particles is one illness, one part of this illness, but so is the body's own immunity and kind of over-immunity hurting itself. And that's also that's also where cannabinoids can do a lot of good. As I was reading, I saw this one section about sort of an ideal drug and what would an ideal drug look like. And I put it here on purpose. I think an ideal drug, and I agree, an ideal drug for treating cytokine storm would be already in use for other indications. So it's not a new medicine. It has a favorable side effect and safety profile. It has multi-targeted action. So it's not just a laser precise thing. It's kind of working in a multi-system way. And it synergistically, it works with the body's natural system to mitigate cytokine storm as an immunomodulatory agent, meaning it's interacting in a slowing down way, not suppressing, not shutting off the immunity. And of course, all of these are characteristics of the cannabinoids. What I'm finding kind of through this reading is basically there are two major action locations for where cannabinoids work. One is the binding to and preventing the SARS-CoV-2 receptor binding location and the translation. So either the viral particle getting in or as it's converting its RNA into proteins. Those are two places where cannabinoids work best. And then also acting as an agonist, a kind of actor of the CB2 receptor. That's that receptor on all of the immune cells to help reduce the inflammatory cytokine levels, at least in the lungs, but actually in the whole body. So I'm kind of trying to narrow all of this gobbledygook into sort of, two concrete locations where cannabinoids are effective and meaningfully so. Hopefully that's clear. And then dosages. So as I look through, this is, of course, meaty material. What dose do I take? What do I take? What's the product? What's the magic sort of formula? Cut to the chase. There is no magic formula. This is all research. We're learning a lot. There is no kind of one way to do it. And everybody's different in their strategy to approach illness, their daily life, how much water they're drinking to be hydrated, how healthy they are in terms of nutrition and sleep. There's a whole soup of stuff that's complicated about an illness. That's why we have doctors, and that's why doctors are spending so much of their lives in classrooms and in patient care, because there's a lot to learn. But the formula that comes up often in the literature I've copied here, basically 45% of active cannabis doctors in the United States at least recommend about 10 milligrams a day, which is divided usually 3-ish milligrams of THC, TID. And this is not to treat COVID. This is to treat things like pain and fibromyalgia, arthritis that Dr. Exelberg was referring to before, sleep issues, difficulty with eating. This is not what to do with COVID. I'm just making this separation here. This is what is currently happening out there. Most cannabis physicians, cannabis clinicians are recommending very, very low dosages. Those tend to work for symptoms. For most people, most of the time, it's hard to generalize, but basically low doses tend to work for most people at the beginning. That is not what is being studied for this sort of viral stuff that we're talking about here today. What we are talking about here is much, much higher dosages. And even medical versus the sort of rec or adult use world are different dosages. And by and large, when people are consuming for their own pleasure, they tend to be massive doses. People are looking for fireworks and sort of loud effects in their body. They tend to take very, very large doses. That's also where most of the kind of unpleasant aspects of cannabis come from, is when people take more than they need to. But that's a second category, which is different from the research of COVID sort of stuff. And what we know in these animal models and the Petri dishes, we are learning in the setting of massive doses. So 75 milligrams per kilogram, which would be about 360 milligrams for an average small person. So 360 milligrams is what they're studying for these kinds of things in animal models. And then most people are prescribing and recommending 10 milligrams. So massive difference. Hopefully that's abundantly clear. In research doses is just another way of saying it. People are recommending between 100 and 300 milligrams a day. One researcher, which was sort of blowing my mind, actually recommended a specific therapeutic dose in sort of clinical practice. It's sort of a big no-no. Most of the time in research, they stay clear of clinical expertise because most of them are doing research. They're not doing a lot of patient care. But in this one particular paper, this particular author suggested that CBD could be given at 100 milligrams daily to start with, titrating, moving up all the way up to 300 milligrams a day. This dosage is basically looking at avoiding bad effects, promoting some of the benefits that they're studying. The reality is very few people are taking 300 milligrams of CBD a day. I can't say I know maybe more than a dozen. And that's pretty costly. In the real life market, 300 milligrams of CBD a day is not cheap unless you're growing it yourself or buying it wholesale. And interestingly, we have talked a little bit about terpenes and how they're effective. I think there might be room for terpenes to be part of this discussion, but research as it is, it's mostly focusing on CBD. Related news, this is stuff that's in the folder about COVID and cannabis that is not necessarily part of the talk today, but was interesting and I thought worth sharing. One of the things I read was about immunosuppressants. So there are a lot of people who have overactive immunity and they're on medicines which calm that immunity down. In this paper, which actually just came out last month, pointed out that people that are taking immunosuppressives, so folks who have a too high immune system, they're taking medicines to calm it down, they're not at increased risk for death or for being on a ventilator than people who are not on those medicines. So if we think about cannabis as a medicine that suppresses immune system, modulates immune system, kind of quiets the alarm system down, at least by inference, we can imagine that if folks who are taking immune modulating medicines aren't at increased risk of death or ventilator use, it seems logical that folks who are taking cannabis wouldn't be either. Next piece of news. This got a weakness of cannabis studies. I just threw this in there. Basically, cannabis studies are very hard to do. Folks are intimidated to get the money to pay for them being done. They often have small sample sizes because it's not so easy to find people to be involved in these. The outcome measures, what they're looking for, is not always consistent, and it's hard to kind of put them together and build a story that's founded on other stories. And the studies are often not very long in duration, so you're learning about a very small window. Another big problem with the cannabis literature is, as folks might know, as time goes on, part of what happens with literature in small doses, small studies, they're combined into what are called systematic studies or meta-analyses. And if you're finding that the culture is changing, if the products are changing over time, which of course they are, what you learn in small studies is not so hard to group in other studies, and you kind of get the wrong message. And if someone wants to include these kinds of people, but not those kinds of people, you can get results out of cannabis studies which are drastically different. And as people look through the cannabis literature, that's often a very big frustration that, oh my gosh, this says it's fantastic, and not the same thing says, this other paper says it's terrible. And it's a mess in literature because cannabis is changing so much, the attitudes about cannabis and the research approach is so different. I guess that's a non sequitur gripe about cannabis literature. One clear message I hope people will take away, a simple message, is smoking is bad. We don't recommend smoking from a chemistry perspective. Heating up product way beyond its boiling point is just incinerating what you pay for. It's mutating stuff, creating things you don't want. In this context of COVID, smoking cannabis or tobacco, causes a lot of irritation locally. It introduces things that don't belong. It's a problematic way of consuming cannabis. These days, there are a million other choices. I would just encourage everybody to find a way to not necessarily jump off the smoking boat immediately, but transition off and find other things that you might like and move away from. Concerns with smoke and thick concentrates. So another thing people have reason to be concerned about are, vaporizing very, very thick stuff. These days it's very fun and simple and user friendly to use vapor cartridges. And the interesting thing about vapor cartridges is that it's simple, it's almost mindless. You get the effect you might want in a matter of seconds. But keep in mind, if people are cooking these things on the street, if they're selling them not out of medical dispensaries, there can be adulteration. You can put things in them that you don't want in your body. That was sort of what happened with the vapor crisis of 2019, continues to happen, unfortunately, today. So products can be contaminated, but that's not exclusively a thing of the streets. When people are selling, when dispensaries are selling cartridges, the cartridges are made in very cost-effective ways. They're made with soldered metal to keep metal parts static. Some of that soldering can have heavy metal particles. So when we test cannabis, we test the cannabis. We don't necessarily test the things that they're being sold with or consumed inside of. It's important to know that some contamination can happen there. It is possible to consume cannabis in a healthy way. It's also possible to consume it in a very easy, inexpensive way. And I would encourage people watching who are mindful of their health to be aware of that difference. As I was alluding to, smoking can be irritating to the lungs. That's a fact that we see in sort of inhaling of anything, that you inhale a lot of stuff, whether it's allergen particles while you're taking a walk, or smoking a pipe, smoking cigarettes, smoking cannabis, you can get irritation. We do see some of that irritation in people that are inhaling thick concentrates as well. From a cellular perspective, smoking concentrates is a little bit like downing a quintuple espresso when coffee might be suitable, sort of coffee Americano. You don't always need that massive dose, and sometimes that extra dose can have systemic issues. If we're talking about calming down an immune system, taking a massive dose of cannabis is going to have a massive calming effect, maybe more than necessary. Interesting study I came across showed among LGBTQ cannabis consumers and alcohol consumers that 19% had been using more cannabis over the pandemic. This is something that I've seen in abundance. Folks are consuming a lot of cannabis in part because they're worried, they're feeling stressed, they don't have as much access to medical care as they might want, and cannabis is helping them feel better. So that number in a LGBTQ population happened to be 19. But interestingly, in another separate study, totally unrelated, looking at Australian adults, they actually had an increase of consumption of cannabis at 19% too. I don't think there's anything magical about that number. It's just a fun coincidence. Another interesting study that's in the folder is about the ACE2 receptor. We were talking about that as sort of a way for preventing viral particles from getting in. But the ACE2 is also related to hypertension and the way our blood pressure is in the body. And folks who consume cannabis over a long period of time tend to have lower blood pressures than people who are not consuming cannabis. And one of the interesting things that's in the folder for tonight was that maybe this is the mechanism of action through that ACE2 receptor, which again is part of all of the systems in the body that I highlight. Vasorelaxation, the relaxation of blood vessels, can also be related to this blood pressure effect. And yep, the paper's there. We'll leave it there. Another unrelated but interesting piece of news, in a study that looked at folks who have severe disabilities, all kinds of disabilities with daily living. Either they couldn't walk around, they can't serve themselves and sort of do basic things. They tend to use cannabis more during the pandemic, and certainly more cannabis than either other recreational drugs, including alcohol and tobacco. And people are turning to cannabis because it's helping them and they're feeling helpful. These graphs look similar, but if you look at the y-axis, you can see the magnitude of cannabis effect is quite different. All right. Social, psychological suffering. Most of what we're talking about here is sort of in the cell world, microscopic view of cannabis, but there's a whole avenue of suffering that happens with COVID in terms of social and psychology. This is a list of things that we hear in clinic as complaints all the time. Dr. Exelberg, do you want to jump in? I mean, the things that strike you. One of the things that we all are suffering with are, these social dynamics are all different. We're all working from home. We're all living from home.
Sure.
People have lost their income. They're feeling depressed and anxious. people turn to cannabis for that. And as you and I have seen in clinic, they tend to be incredibly well helped for those kinds of concerns.
Yeah, I think people have looked, there's been a multitude of reasons, I think, why. I mean, I think at least during COVID, people have been scared to leave the house, go to their doctors, although you can make an argument to go to dispensaries, although dispensaries do a job of pickup and delivery, which is a little bit different than traditional pharmaceuticals for the most part, although places are getting better at that. But I think people are frustrated with the medical system. You and I talk about this all the time. I think cannabis has enabled patients to have some control and allow them to participate, if you want to call it, in their medical care, especially when they're going through some different social or psychological suffering that they're not getting benefit from the medications that are being given. People are becoming impatient. And I think that there has been, an immediate effect that people get from various forms of cannabinoids. And then, of course, with CBD and time and how CBD has helped patients who are on serotonin secretin releasing inhibitors or drugs like Zoloft and Prozac, we know how much that the cannabinoids affect the serotonin system. So I think that the good thing is that there's been a lot more people. I think that cannabis has had nice open discussion among people. I think there's more people like you and I who are very open and pretty easy to talk to about things that have been not so easy in the past, especially with children. So I think that there's clearly been a change in what's been going on in terms of just suffering in general. But I definitely think that cannabis has given people another option and a much more safe option.
Mm-hmm. This was just interesting to note that of course, life as it is, it's never all bad. There is a silver lining for some people. And some of that is, I've heard a lot of patients of mine actually consuming less cannabis during the pandemic than they used to. That sort of strikes you for a minute, but as I'm learning from my patients, these are sometimes people who are stressed out at work and dealing with the pressures of going to work, or the people at work they just don't like, and all of a sudden, if you're at home, you have a release of that pressure. Or people who are at home with their kids, spending more time getting to know their own families. That's a real positive for some people. It's hard to talk about positives in a sort of situation that is so dire and so awful for so many millions of people. But I think it's sort of important to recognize that it's not terrible for everybody. We humans persevere. So ongoing studies. One, you asked about sort of studies right now, and basically, as of May 15, this is the best I could find for this talk. There are 9 clinical trials, 2 that are active, 5 that are recruiting for patients, 2 not yet recruiting about CBD and COVID directly. And maybe this is a call for anybody who's watching. If you are interested in contributing to science, some of that means free cannabis. Some of it means just helping your fellow man learn. And science depends on contribution. There are also, in established literature, 653 regarding cannabinoids. People often talk about there not being enough evidence for cannabis. It's just baloney. It's just people not reading what's out there. That's part of why we created the Seed Library, to make one-stop shop. You can see it all there. 311 studies that are completed. 30 terminated early. 151 are recruiting. 105 were withdrawn. I mean, this is the reality of medicine, that some bad things happen, funding runs out. It's not always a pretty picture. But there's a ton of literature. There's a ton of activity. It's not like it's crickets going on. It's a huge, huge opportunity. Most of the opportunity in studying cannabis, though, is about FDA-approved pharmaceuticals. CBD now has Epidiolex, this pharmaceutical-produced CBD. Scientists, researchers can also produce what are called synthetic analogs. So a molecule of THC that is not actually from the plant, it's from a machine that produces THC. Those kinds of studies are easier to approve than a natural plant for a lot of reasons that we won't get into here. But it is important to know that as we study cannabis, it's never quite the ideal picture. And when people talk about, oh, there's not enough study, even the study that there isn't necessarily 100% translatable to real life. We live in this idealistic world where we want to protect people. We want to make sure that drugs which are approved are without side effects, they're not hurting people. but those drugs are studied on very, very, very particular circumstances, with averaged people and average numbers, but also with product, which is not necessarily what you're going to have in real life. And even the indications, the sort of reasons that people are studying, are very specific. Dravet syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut. These are sort of not necessarily universally applicable scenarios, but a lot of medicine is practiced, even though it was studied on one thing, it's sometimes offered to others in very different positions. It's just important to mention this in the context of studies, because there's this asymptote, this unachievable line that we only had certain data, we would be good and we would be fine. But really, that's a silly concept. That everywhere along the research pathway, there are reasons to doubt that and reasons to think outside the box. Recap, we covered a lot in an hour. We covered sort of how cannabinoids and COVID overlap. We covered some risks of cannabis use. We covered benefits of cannabinoids. How do they work? How do they work with COVID? What is COVID-19? How do cannabinoids work against COVID-19? What are the dosages? And I covered my section of related news. For those who are interested, I am on Twitter and Clubhouse often. The handle there is @Dr. Kaplan. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. We can also accept personal invitations and consultations, both Dr. Exelbert and I, through seedclinic.com, that's cedclinic.com. And any question, any concern is fair game. We're here to help people and help people learn. And then for those who want the academic resources from today, the whole folder here, the bit.ly/CED COVID, you can find every paper that I read to review this talk, and all the stuff that I talked about is there. Nothing outside of there. Appointments I mentioned already, seed videos. We have a slew of these videos out there. And then the library, which is not just the COVID folder, is almost 100 gigabytes of papers and published material. That's seedclinic.com/lib, L-I-B. So one question we got was about the dosages, and I'd mentioned 100 milligrams moving up to 300 milligrams. The question was about, was that CBD isolate? And that was, this is one of those areas of esoteric science where in order to publish a study, they have to look at very, very specific predictable CBD. And that's CBD isolate, meaning it's one molecule, it's isolated CBD, and that's what you get in a whole bottle. That's in contrast to a full spectrum product, which is not just an isolate. And we know from other literature that full spectrum products tend to work better in almost all scenarios than isolates, but they're a little bit less predictable because it's not a uniform, homogeneous solution. But in that particular study, it was CBD isolate that people were recommending. My recommendation, just seeing that one study would be, hey, just go over to the full spectrum choice because it's probably going to work better anyway. All right, well, we'll call it a night there. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us, questions@cedclinic.com, or visit the website, and hopefully we'll see you next time.